Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us here on what promises to be, and I'm being given that confidence by my panel that this is going to be a provocative conversation to really get people moving and do something about the issue that we're here to talk about, and that is the road to climate adaptation. While there is a lot of emphasis, a lot of focus, courtesy what's happening at the COPs to try and focus on climate mitigation, I think the sense in this room is very clear that that is something that has to work in parallel with our strategy on climate adaptation, and we need to move on that now. We need to move on that today. So without further ado, we've seen changes in the world around us, large parts of the world, developing economies, low-income economies, developed economies are facing the crisis of the changes that we are seeing, whether it's floods, wildfire, the impact on agriculture, the impact on food, energy. All of that is front and center for us to take cognizance of today. The question, though, is there enough will at this point in time, political, business will? Is there enough financing? Is there access to technology? Can we ensure that access to technology is going to be equitable? Who is going to fund all of this? Those are some of the questions that we are going to be addressing here on this panel. Let me very quickly introduce our panelists to you. I'm going to start with my left, Parameshwaran Iyer. He's the CEO of the think tank, the government think tank in India called the Niti Aayog. Also with us, Ms. Kamdani, the coordinating vice chairman of Maritime Investment and International Relations at the Indonesian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Thank you very much for joining us. P.K. Sebasama, the chairman of the Supervisory Board, Royal Philips, member and of the Board of Trustees of the World Economic Forum. P.K., many thanks for joining us. Jacqueline Heard, the chief executive officer and founder of Enko. She joins us from the US. And of course, Bob Moritz, Group Chairman of PwC and of the International Business Council. So without further ado, P.K., let me get started with you. We're very clear that we need to move in parallel as far as adaptation and mitigation is concerned, and that has to be the way forward. How far have we moved on that front? How far have we moved on realizing that adaptation requires intervention? It requires urgent intervention.
Yes, thank you, and thanks for organizing this panel. I'm glad that adaptation gets more and more attention, but we are not yet there at all. People found it difficult to understand what is now all these climate actions, climate mitigation, adaptation, what is all, loss and damage, etc.
Break it down for everybody who's watching.
Mitigation is trying to prevent that we come above 1.5 degrees, so decreasing emissions. Although we know we will not manage that. We need to continue with mitigation, but we will not manage it. Already today, for Africa, for Indonesia, for India, climate change is a reality, not to grow enough food to eat. So it's nothing for the future, something today. So therefore, next to mitigation, we need to work on adaptation, making our food systems more resilient, that we can grow food. Also, when it is flooding or droughts, then we have different water systems, infrastructure cities. That is adaptation. Then we have a third one added to that recently in Egypt. That's loss and damage, where we admitted that there is a root cause by some and there is some suffering. So that's more a financing thing, still need to be filled in. On the adaptation, it is not enough money which is allocated now. Only 20% of what is needed is now being available. And that 20% does not find its way with business. Only 1% of the global adaptation budget is spent by business. Business is almost absent in the total adaptation thing. Although companies, and Bob and I were in a big session with 80 CEOs this week, who were really enthusiastic to contribute, but they also don't know how, where, etc. Yeah. And the companies do not find the funds do not find the companies, and that is a problem what we have. But we cannot rely only on mitigation. We need to work on adaptation. Macky Sall, the chairman of the African Union, said, and the same counts for Africa, that counts for Asian countries like Bangladesh or Indonesia, India. He said, listen, we Africans suffer the most of climate change today. We Africans cost the least, also true. And we are not so sure that you, pinpointing to the West, do care enough. Now, some people said this is not a helpful statement. And I said, well, maybe it's very inconvenient, but I don't think it's incorrect. And therefore, we need to take that up. So adaptation needs to be much higher on the agenda. And we need to be able to involve the private sector also to come with new seeds that can grow when there's not enough water, with new water systems, with new way to protect cities for floodings, with new way to protect infrastructure, etc. And the technologies are there, but we have still to orchestrate it. And we need to make clear what it is. And one last thing, on mitigation, we have a clear goal. We need to keep the world below 1.5 degrees. Okay. On adaptation, we need to become more resilient, whatever that is. We don't have a clear, common, well-defined single goal, and that makes it more complicated.
Well, thank you very much for those opening remarks, Feike, because I think that sets the context for the conversation that we intend to have. So that's a fairly frustrated voice that I hear on the panel, and also a reality check. Bob Moritz, let me address this issue with you. As Feike pointed out, and you were talking to me about this as well just before we started, that if there were 80 CEOs in Davos who were talking about climate change and the need for intervention, the need for collaboration, why is Feike saying that there is no will at this point in time? There is no access to finance. We don't know who to go to, where to go to, and how to put those two together. Why this deficit?
So as Feike described, we have a great conversation. And I want to be clear, the CEOs have been having conversations on the topic of mitigation, and they have been taking action on that. I want to be super clear. What we have done is done it in lieu of, and unfortunately at the expense of, adaptation. So the WEF, and appropriately so, commissioned a report that actually would do the course correction to bring the business community, to bring equal prominence to the business narrative, the government narrative, and the societal narrative of why this is important. And in order to do that, what's it going to take to get the business community to step up to the challenge, not to at the expense of mitigation, but rather get equal amount of time, attention, capital, and action on the issue of adaptation. The report specifically talks about how do we enhance this in terms of the business resiliency that businesses have to deal with. How do we actually turn a negative into a positive in terms of the upside potential? I'll come back to that point in a second. And third, how do we bring together collaborative examples where it has helped business, but also society, local communities? And that's usually important. I want to come back to that point. So the report itself did a study of 100 companies. And to Feike's point, this issue is here now. Of the 100 companies, 70 of them already have gone through catalytic issues that have actually impacted, because of the physical issues, the physical risk issues, an event happened that has never happened before, and it is happening more and more times. And the reality is, in one given year, it's 10% of the revenue. Go to the other side of the equation. If, in fact, these organizations did the things we're asking them to do in terms of the innovative techniques, leveraging technologies, which we'll talk about in a second, there is upside potential. That upside potential comes in the form of revenue, brand, stakeholder capitalism coming through, and the avoidance of cost, therefore the avoidance of investment. That investment can go to other places to actually achieve the SDGs. Let's bring it to life with reality, because Feike and I are talking about abstracts. I was in India last month. Met with a company that manages a port city. The CEO of that particular port city came into this 5 years ago. And the historical trend was we had 5 days of rain annually. Today, they're having 65 days of rain and 5 flooding events each and every year that they never had before. This particular company, they themselves invested the capital to bring it to life and adopt. And they did not walk away from that port city. This is one important thing. Two messages to leave this group as you think about this. One, whatever we do on adaptation, we cannot reduce the mitigation efforts that Feike talked about. Point number one. Point number two, adaptation does not mean walking away from a city that may have potential flooding or drought risk. It means working with the city, working with the government to make sure that we stay, for societal benefit, for societal reasons, and we have the economic development happening. And that's where capital has to come in the big time way. So the CEOs in that deficit, this is now the pivot. The report was helping accelerate that pivot. And that's what we're looking to see over the next year or two.
Excellent. I'll get to the issue of financing and capital in just a second, but let me get Ms. Kamdani into the conversation as well. You've heard what 5K as well as Bob Moritz have had to say. You know, you come from Indonesia. As we've been pointing out, it is countries like India, Indonesia, Africa that are facing the vulnerabilities, the challenges of what is happening to climate change at this point in time. Is this a matter that has political buy-in? Is there political will to try and see where you can access technology, where you can access capital to try and move down this road? What is the experience at this point in time?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to join this panel. I was excited yesterday hearing, the leaders was talking about climate change, and I think Vice President Al Gore was saying, political will is renewable resource, right? So the feeling that I get right now is when we talk about, we don't even have to talk about adaptation yet, talk about climate change in general. There's still a big gap between the developed countries and developing countries. And we have to address that gap, because when businesses come to picture, we cannot just look at the global businesses. We have to also talk about the local businesses. So first of all, I think what is adaptation?
Mm-hmm.
You were mentioning even the most advanced companies are still not clear. How about us? Where we're coming from? We're between. Mitigation is we're starting, but adaptation is still very far off, right? So what it is actually needs to be social. We need to educate.
Mm-hmm.
And what kind of program can we actually do? And when we talk about the who, right, it's government, yes, but where does each government stand also differ in their point, right? There are so many priorities of government. When we talk even about achieving net zero, of course they will commit themselves. Indonesia had committed to 2016 achieving net zero, but it's just a commitment, right? We know that has to be translated to companies on how they're going to achieve the net zero. So the work needs time. It is a process. And I just feel like we're running behind this time, right? And so that's, I think, bringing the actors. This is definitely a stakeholder engagement. We need to bring all actors in place. And this cannot be just government, business. It has to be all, the civil society. And lastly, also, when we talk about the how, yes, I agree. Technology important. Yes, I agree. Finance is very, very important. But we have, in our part of the world, have to look at the social components.
Mm-hmm.
So many of the effort that we're doing are hindered by the social aspect. So the intergenerational social aspect is very, very important, and we have to prioritize and put through this as well. Now, in ASEAN, we have, of course, done a number of things, and one of the first thing that's important is building infrastructure. Many of our countries face natural disasters. Yeah. So for sure, we need to build infrastructure. We need to build seawall for flooding. We need to build the building that's resilient to disaster. So this infrastructure building is number one. And second, when we talk about, we talk about deforestation, we talk about forestry. We are, right now working on mangrove. Mangrove. During the G20 leadership of Indonesia, we invited all the leaders in Bali to go to mangrove. I think mangrove restoration it's a big thing, and this is we are starting with that as well. And the third aspect also, we have this called the strategic regional strategy on adaptations. Mm-hmm. So we're working on, the research and development, on sharing best practices, working, how capacity building can be built. So ASEAN is working, and we will translate this as well into our ASEAN agenda when we host this year. But Indonesia itself, right now, we are trying to work within different aspects. One is from the village part. We have a program called the Development Environment Villages. Environment Villages is working with, we have 1,000 villages right now that working on how to really do adaptation within the village, working on decarbonization and so forth. We have also work on within urban context, so the urban context we work with ADB in Makassar, for example, in how to do the urban mobilization, the urban resilience, building. So things like this, we actually concrete on the ground. We start to do it. We look into the gender perspective. I think women, we really believe that in order to make adaptation work, gender needs to play into place, and has to that can be effective, right? So we put women and children. That is also a component that we are also working on at the moment.
Absolutely, you're right in pointing out that it requires a much more holistic approach, and we need to look at issues like social justice and gender justice as well when we talk about the road to adaptation. But Indonesia has passed on the G20 baton to India, so let me come to you, Paramayor, and address the issues that have been raised by the panel here. In the context of India, the how have we been able to address that? In terms of being able to measure what needs to be done, how is the government looking at this issue at this point in time in terms of identifying outcomes, impact, and more importantly, what is the biggest challenge that you face when we talk about adaptation and the need for adaptation? Is financing the issue? Is technology the issue? Is will the issue? What are the deterrents?
Sure. As the G20 presidency is currently with India, just to remind ourselves that the overall theme is one Earth, one family, one future. And I think in an interconnected world, mitigation or adaptation, both are equally important. But we are coming out of COP27 and the sort of rebalancing of bringing adaptation back to the table, as was discussed, is very relevant for India. If you look at our NDCs, both mitigation and adaptation are equally balanced. So in terms of adaptation from an Indian context, clearly, I come from the water sector, as you know, Shereen, and I've worked for many years globally on water. And I think it came up, mentioned about the port city in India. Really, water and climate are very closely connected. And if you look at water, it's either too little or too much or too polluted. And, so you've got floods, you've got droughts, and you've got pollution of groundwater. So again, it's critical. And, we're facing that in India. We are a water scarce country. Surprisingly, we get the monsoon, which is there for about 8 weeks, but it all runs off. So we don't have enough storage. So how do we adapt to this? Just one sector. So increasingly, there's a focus on how to build resilient infrastructure. And water was just one example. But what we are trying to do is we're trying to identify the most vulnerable areas. So where the cities, coastal areas, food and agriculture, infrastructure. So it's important to have a vulnerability index, which is something which we have started doing, so we can prioritize areas for adaptation. But there are some very good examples. And as you know, India's got some big numbers, and we typically deliver at scale, whether it's on sanitation or drinking water. The state of UP alone, which is, if you look at population, is the 5th or 6th largest country in the world with about 250 million people. They've embarked on a very ambitious adaptation program, which you could call, it's a little bit of mitigation as well. How do you get farmers to move into more resilient and sustainable practices for rice, for example? Instead of using flood irrigation, they're now moving to direct seeding of rice, which obviously is going to take less water, but also gives you more productivity, gives the farmer a higher income. You've got to take care of the weeds, of course. So that's a big challenge. But that's one aspect of how adaptation is taking place at scale. Another area is along our coast, learning from the Indonesia and the Bali summit. The Prime Minister of India was also part of that visit. And we are now considering embarking on a major program of mangrove plantations along our 7,000 kilometers of coastline. So this one is going to be, so if we can get that right, obviously it's going to be very challenging. It's going to take a lot of financing, but it will also include livelihoods, particularly through Manrega, a rural employment guarantee program, and women will be major beneficiaries. So, that's a program, adaptation, which will benefit women in particular. the third aspect I wanted to mention is something which the Prime Minister announced at Glasgow, lifestyle for the environment. How can individuals and communities adapt to climate change, which is very, very real in India? You know, whether you're using less water or whether, you know, you are using less electricity in an era of climate change. So that's a major program which will also feature in the G20. And of course, climate, environment, life, the energy transition are all major themes in the G20. But one point which we've always been emphasizing again, and, you know, so, you know, where's the money?
Yeah.
And so climate financing, the technology transfer will be important, but capacity building as well. So there are major challenges in India. The government, you know, will do everything it can. It's got ambitious programs on adaptation as well. Climate, obviously on emissions mitigation, that's another agenda, but they go together. I think climate change has got to be looked at holistically. And so in India, we are very cognizant of the reality of the now of the now. And we believe we are acting on it, and hopefully this message can resonate in the G20 as well.
So 3 important points that you talked about. Where's the money? I'll get to Bob and Paike with that question in just a second. Building capacity and capabilities, and of course the issue of technology and technology transfer. Jacqueline, let me come to you. You know, Jacqueline is the food person on this panel, as she called herself. So in light of what you've heard today, the answer also lies in being able to provide equitable innovation, frugal innovation at scale to be able to achieve some of these immediate challenges that we need to address. How confident, hopeful do you feel in your own experience with what you are doing that we will be able to get to that?
Thank you. It's great to be here. Great to be part of this conversation as a mission-driven innovator. But I'm very optimistic when it comes to technology, and I think there's amazing technology that's already out there. I think, you know, we can talk about climate smart technologies, whether it's climate adapted animals, it's crops that are drought tolerant, heat tolerant, you know, even early warning systems with the potential for AI to predict disease outbreaks or, you know, weather events. I think so. I'm very confident that the technologies that are out there exist. You know, and even when you look at the difference between global yields in the first world versus the third world, you know that it can be so much better than it is today. Some of the issues are surrounding the fact that many people think that, well, those are technologies that are only accessible or only applicable to large-scale agriculture. But that's not true. As we know, 80% of all farmers are smallholder farmers, and there are a lot of technologies that scale up and scale down. And so it's really what I am most concerned about is actually access to those technologies. Historically, it's been the biggest issue is access. And even as an innovator, when I think about how do I make sure that my technology gets to the places that it needs to go very quickly, we partner. We partner with people that have a global footprint, and that I think is one of the ways. But we're not far enough along in having these coalitions and these partnerships with governments, with the private sector, with innovators, to really ensure that we know what's needed where and how to get it when. And so I think optimistic on the technology, a little bit concerned about access and technology, but then there's the adoption. So assume we can get technology to the places that it's needed. How do we get farmers who are very traditional? It's a livelihood, it's not necessarily a business. How do we get them to be a part of the solution as well as a rapid adopter of new technologies to make this impact? And so, this is an area where I think, the importance, if you talk about infrastructure and the needs of infrastructure, that will facilitate Digital infrastructure will facilitate access. It will facilitate adoption of technologies. And I think mostly because it will facilitate the education. This is the human component. This is the community component of it. And the education, you have to educate the youth, the young farmers, the people who are going to be the next generation farmers on what's coming. And it also, I think I think you have to mitigate some of the worry and some of the fear with education and the opportunities, and that, you know, the world is there to support you and technology can be made available. So I think those are the three areas, you know, that I think are the most critical.
Well, thank you very much, Jacqueline, for putting the silver lining into the conversation. And that really is the power of technology. But the question, though, is access to technology. So let's address the access deficits first. And Faiki, let me start by talking about capital, because that is something that everyone on the panel has raised as an issue, as a constraint. Where is the money going to come from? How much money do we need?
Well, maybe let's start with the money we are destroying and making clear that climate change is not something for the future we need to be afraid of, but is something today. Last year, only of physical infrastructure, we had over 100 billion money damage and money lost of physical harm of infrastructure, houses, farms, whatever, over 100 billion. Insurance companies increasingly say in certain areas, certain risks are not theoretical risk, which we statistically can calculate once in 100 years, once in 50 years, but will happen every single year. If it happens every single year, we are not going to insure that anymore, because that's our model. And people expect that that 100 billion will increase every single year. Next to that, millions of people last year, millions of people lost their life due to climate change. So we need to continue with the mitigation, like Bob was saying, and the CEOs and business and everybody want to prevent it more and more. But in parallel, once again, we need to work on adaptation. Two things on that one, on the money. The business sector needs to step up. And one thing which I'm a little bit puzzled about is that the business sector has two reasons to join the adaptation. One is purely out of self-interest, because business has a vulnerable supply chain in agricultural streams, in flooding of sites, in droughts, or if you are in South Africa, there's no drinking water, don't expect you people to appear on work, etc. So why not adapt your own supply chain and your own operations and spend money there? That's purely self-interest. And it is that the people, money business leaders do not fully get it yet. Now, I think the insurance sector can play an important role, because if they don't want to insure your activities anymore, you will get a strong wake-up call. At the end of the day, there need to be a private-public collaboration. And like I said, 99% of the adaptation money is coming from the public sector now. That cannot be. We expect even at the end of the day that 80%, now it's 1%, that 80% will come from the private sector. The private sector needs to invest much more in adaptation. Now, I think to get over the hurdle, I think the private sector needs to find the funds which are available publicly now. Those funds need to find the private sector need to find the funds. We can help to orchestrate that. And then hopefully we lift up, because I totally agree with you, I'm hopeful also. Strange enough, partly the technologies are there. There are big seed companies who have developed new seeds, which can grow also when there's a shortage of water. That's exactly what Africa needs. So the technologies are being developed, and now we need to find a way to make that for business. A business model also is finding that money, because business can do it from CSR activities, but that is not a sustainable model forever. So we need to allow them to make some money with that. And if we can bridge that gap, I think we can make a giant step forward.
So can I build on Faiki's points, please, around this capital point? Now, there's three sub-components to it, which are really important. First, you've got to get the business narrative so the private sector wants to invest, and you want to make sure that the ROI is super clear, either from a self-interest perspective to what they do, or for that matter, the ROI they're going to get. And if you actually look at the ROIs embedded in either mitigation or adaptation, you're probably more likely to get a higher ROI from the avoidance of the cost and all the liabilities associated with it if you actually focus on adaptation. So we've got to just make that business case perfectly clear to the financing organizations that are out there, and get the business community to be more vocal on that particular point in terms of what they need to do. Second, you've got to bring the public-private partnership together, and where the business community can help more so, where those evangelists can help more so, is how can we make it easier for politicians to say yes? Because this is usually now political at the local level. It is a crowded agenda in terms of what they are focused on, spending money on, and especially as you go into an environment where there's going to be less revenues and therefore less ability to invest, how do you make it a higher priority? So we've got to help the politicians in terms of why this is so important, which goes to the third point. How do I not only deal with the capital necessary to get to the large-scale infrastructure projects, but how do I get the capital to the right people at the local farm level to then be able to leverage that technology, change the way they actually do some things, and actually get it to the ground in the small and medium-sized enterprises where candidly the biggest inclusive economic opportunity is for them personally, as well as the societal impact that it can have. And that's the combination of things that we have to do, hence the reason we wrote the report the way we did.
Well, I agree with you. I think we need to see a much more robust public-private partnership, and that's what I want to address with you, Paramayor, to start with. We've experimented with public-private partnerships in different sectors, whether it's education or healthcare and so on and so forth. But as some of these objectives that have been outlined, specifically from a climate adaptation risk perspective, what is the role that you believe the government and the private sector together in collaboration can play? Access to finance was one of the concerns that you raised. That perhaps is going to be something that is solvable if you get both parties together on the table. But how are you approaching the need for greater public-private partnership to address this challenge?
Sure, I think a couple of ways. One is, of course, in terms of financing. So when we're talking of, how do you make our infrastructure more resilient? How do you make your highways and buildings? So there's a huge opportunity in the program we have in India, which is the asset monetization program, where you're getting in private sector to finance the capital. There's a model called the hybrid annuity model, the HAM. That's just one of them. So again, in that scope, in terms of the scope of resilience, that can be brought in. It's in everyone's interest, as we said. So that's one area where you can get them to finance, but again, in a resilient way. But if you look at a community level, how do you get them to have access to technology related to adaptation? In India, as you know, it's a huge digital story. So now you have broadband for every village in India. And the partnership is that at the village level, it'll be private operators who will come in to give people access to the internet. So today there are more than 600 startups in the agri-food sector, going all the way from, so if you look at a startup in agri-business, for a farmer in India, in a remote area, he doesn't have to go anymore to the bank because of India Stack and Agri Stack, where because of our Aadhaar, because of UPI, so the availability of credit is becoming much easier. But then the technology for a farmer to know what's the weather like in terms of climate, is the monsoon coming earlier? What's going to be the climate like? Plus, where do I sell my food? And so increasingly now, with technology becoming accessible and to a large extent going down to the lowest level and sort of bridging that digital divide, I think that's the force which we can bring to the adaptation debate as well. And that's public, private, and local.
Yeah. Let me address this issue with you as well.
Well, first of all, when we talk about the financing, I think there's definitely this 100 billion figure running around, right? Developed countries' commitment to developing countries, 100 billion. Where's the money? 30 billions now are out, if I'm not mistaken, and that's not even in the form of, it's like in the form of loan, and so the commitment from developed countries are actually, the realization is not really there yet, right? Now, when we talk about even Indonesia, right? We can't expect government doesn't have budget for things like this. So that means we have to get money rolled out from the MDB, and private sectors. Which private sector? Are we talking about the banking? I mean, I think going back again to return, right? I mean, at the end of the day, the model needs to work. We have to find the model that can work. And this is always the problem. We've been talking about this, but how do actually make it work? And I just want to give an example, because we just went through the whole G20 process, and as you know, we have this outcome called the JETP, the Just Energy Transition Partnership, right? 20 billion. Wow, we're very happy with 20 billion for Indonesia, 15 billion for Vietnam. Our concern is right now, how are we going to make it happen, right? For coal retirement, can coal retirement actually work? Can commercially work, right? And then we want to obviously accelerate renewable, that's there. But the just component, is what's very much related to when we talk about adaptation. You know, when we talk about moving to the just part, we talk about the job losses. Are we ready, you know, to accommodate all these social tech issues? So I think, you know, we have to be realistic, you know, with what can actually be done. But my take on this is, can we do something concrete happening that we can see, you know? And I think the public-private partnership definitely can be there. I mean, we're ready. The private sector's business are ready. You know, the government is ready. But capacity-wise, each government is different. There's no one model fits what all, right? And this is where I think we need a very focused model. We need something concrete that can actually be gone through.
Well, you know, I want to address this issue of justice, and I want to get each one of you to comment on that. There's been a lot of commentary and perhaps exuberance as well on the loss and damage agreement that has been arrived at. But are we clear on how this is going to work? Are we celebrating prematurely? Faike, let me start by asking you. I mean, how confident do you feel that this is going to, in fact, lead to more justice?
Yeah, now you open a third box. Because
I promised a provocative conversation.
No, that's true. So we have the mitigation we talked about. We need now to get the private sector and the world realizing adaptation, and business need to step up. Now in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and we have been discussing this for years, for the first time the world community have agreed on a third box, loss and damage. And what is that? Pakistan triggered that discussion. 1/3 of the country was flooded. And Pakistan said, okay, I need to repair that. Is this my fault that 1/3 of my country is underwater? No, good. Then we talk about loss and damage. Somebody caused it and somebody suffers. Yes, loss and damage. Okay, so we agreed on a loss and damage fund. The only thing which was agreed in Sharm el-Sheikh is we agree on a loss and damage. Immediately after the signing, some countries said, including China, let's be open on that, maybe we are one of the beneficiaries. Europe said, nay, you are one of the contributors, so you need to pay. So it's not decided who are the contributors. It's also not decided who are the beneficiaries. It's also not decided how much money is in there. And it is decided this cannot be a legal game, that you are legal, have a responsibility and accountability. So many things has to be filled in. But I found the breakthrough, and I see the Dutch climate envoy sitting here. He was heavily involved in the negotiations. What is important, that the world community admitted that we suffer from climate change today, that there is a root cause, and that some people cost more, or some countries cost more than other countries, and some suffer more. The fact alone that we have admitted that as a world community is a breakthrough. Because at the end of the day, we need to help Indonesia, and we need to help India, and this is a breakthrough. Now, many things need to be filled in. So now increasingly, we will talk about mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage to make it complicated. And this is, by the way...
Like it wasn't complicated enough already.
This is my big concern, and Bob and I'm talking about it. Do the people still understand how complicated this whole climate narrative is? And we need to do more also in explaining it.
Celebrate the breakthrough. Fantastic. But to be blunt, do not depend on it. You cannot depend on that as a funding mechanism for all the things we are talking about right now anytime soon. Let's just be honest about the bureaucracy, the debate that's going to happen now that we've got to an agreement that we should have the dialogue. This is too big of an issue that's coming at us too fast, and we need capital today. Today. And if we're expecting the world, in parts of the world, particularly in the emerging parts, to wait for that, forget it, folks. We have just further accentuated the disruption and those that are going to be disadvantaged by this right now.
Well, yes, thank you once again for that reality check. I think it is important for us to keep looking into the mirror. But Jacqueline, let me address this issue with you. Since we're talking about solutions, when talking about the next steps now, in your experience, in the context of the conversation that we're having, what would you like the private sector and governments to prioritize at this point in time to make any headway?
I think the biggest priority is digital infrastructure. I'm heartened to hear about the broadband across all of India, because I think there are things that you can do with communication and education today that don't require movement of a lot of technology, like adoption of regenerative agriculture could have a huge impact. And so, I think that those are things where it's about education and getting and communicating with farmers in rural areas to make a big impact. I would also say, really about technology access, for me, this idea of loss and damage and is interesting, because to me, it's about technology access and building internal resiliency. And so in terms of justice, I think there has to be a recognition that if you're getting, compensated for some of the loss, that there's a lot of effort being done in actually trying to build local resiliency in areas. And I know that's challenging, but I would put that out as a provocative challenge, because you can put a lot of money in an endless areas, and having the commitment of governments to build local resiliency is incredible.
Yes.
I want to make sure that when we finish this session, something come out of it.
Yes,
right?
yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Tell us what exactly we should do, right? Because we can't say we just do on our own, like you said. You can't rely on it. We can't, right? We have. Please tell us, how are we? What is there a specific model? I mean, should we come up with specific program, whatever? I mean, should we do it bilaterally? I mean, should we not relying on this big money there? But
thank you. That is the perfect conclusion that we're looking for. Yes, Paramayor.
No, I'm just saying, I don't know if any white smoke is coming out of this session. but certainly I'm not holding my breath. As you said, it'll happen when it happens, if it happens. It's good to know that loss and damage is on the agenda. But clearly, we've got to act now. And I think one important point I wanted to mention, in the G20, as part of our finance track, the reform of the multilateral institutions is key. So we're talking of multilateral institutions for the 21st century, and I've worked in the World Bank for many years. I think they play a critical role now. Let's see if they're going to step up to the plate in terms of at least de-risking private investment. And if we can do that and bring that towards adaptation, I think that could make a difference. But there's a discussion going on, and we will be pushing for that as part of the finance group discussion in India.
Okay.
Let me give one practical example, because I agree with you. A project we started up is private-public in Africa. We started in Rwanda and want to spread it across the continent. We started with 10,000 farmers. Now we have 150,000 farmers in Rwanda. We tell to the farmers, we buy for the next 3 years everything you can grow. The farmer says, hey, we never had 3 days commitment. Now we have 3 years commitment. If you really stick to that, I start investing in agriculture techniques, in new seeds, which I grow even when there's drought or when there's flooding, etc. We give technology to the farmers to do that. Then we bring all the stuff to a big, huge factory we built, few in Kigali. We process it locally for the locally sourced products, locally to healthy products. And now 1.5 million people in Rwanda eat out of that factory, are not stunted anymore, into healthy products. Locally sourced with local farmers doing much better than before, having a horizon and therefore invest, locally processed for the local population. It's financed now private-public by the World Bank, IFC, etc., and some companies. At the end of the day, I want this have locally owned and give this back to the farmers, that they own this also. Then it is locally sourced, locally produced for the local population, and also locally financed and locally owned. That models I think we need to do, because only to help with money and food help is not sustainable. We need to take care that Africa, Indonesia, India can be self-supporting at the end of the day. These kind of scalable initiatives, not local hobbyism, which is nice, but you need to have scalable initiatives, otherwise it doesn't work.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, so let's do Rwanda in Indonesia, right? That's that model. Okay.
There you go. There you go. Something concrete has come out of this panel. Bob, Moritz, we've got exactly a minute, and I'm going to close with you. You talked about how the report points towards a course correction. And that's what I want you to leave the audience with. What are the priorities? What are the imperatives? Where do we need to make the most course correction today?
the three things I would go to is to make sure the narrative is actually on everybody's agenda going forward, and equally as important in the emerging markets that need it most, that have suffered the most and potentially going to suffer the most. Number two, actually get the bankers to help with the capital and the financing associated with this. And third, there are examples like Feike has talked about in lots of parts of the world, including the technology and the education relevant to the labor force. I would just say, as we use you as an example, pick 5 or 6 examples from the rest of the world. Let's bring them in, get them implemented and scaled up as quickly as we possibly can. There's lots of fantastic ideas that are no longer ideas, but rather actionable and having impact. Our challenge is how do we leverage them, scale them, and not waste time in doing so.
Well, I think that is a perfect note to end this conversation. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us here. We have got some concrete action at the end of this panel. I have to admit, I wasn't sure whether we'd be able to stir up enough of a debate and whether we would actually be able to put on the table ideas that each one of us can think about and, more importantly, work on as we go back home. But thank you very much for putting those ideas on the table. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us here this morning. Appreciate your time.